You could tell me some of the things that you see that kind of people misunderstand before they're buying a business.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I see is, as you said, people getting into it, not understanding the amount of work.
What are other ways that you as a lawyer see other lawyers killing deals or just not serving their clients in the process very well?
Yeah, I mean, this gets into a whole conversation around negotiation tactics and strategies.
If you're a buyer, how do you think you suss out whether you've got a lawyer who can do that or if you just have like a hammer where everything is a nail and they're just going to make everything miserable?
It's hard. It's hard for me to answer that question too. I think
Welcome to Deal Makers, the podcast where we go behind all of the clickbait about buying a boring business and talk about things that can kill deals and things that you should look out for. My guest today is Mike Dornik, who is my partner at SKNS Law Group. Mike, thanks for coming. Please introduce yourself a little bit.
Hi, yeah, thanks for having me. Mike Dornik, partner at SKNS Law Group. Been practicing in M&A for a long time. Started out of college doing buy-side analyst work, so buying and developing renewable energy projects. So started there for a few years, decided to go back to law school, went back to law school, did a lot of early stage kind of investing focus, and then ended up at a couple of large companies, did some deals there too. Been doing more since private practice for the past 10 years. So that's kind of been my path.
That's very cool. And we just became partners, right? Not too long ago, but I've known you for a long time. Where did you go to law school?
CU Law.
Oh, all right. And you obviously know our other partner, Tom, who was on earlier. And we've gotten to run some deals together, which is really fun because you've been in private practice for how long now?
So total, well, I should say I've been in practice for 10 years, private practice since 2016, so 9 years. No,
Same.
3 years is that?
I think it's nine. Current, no, to 9.5. Perhaps. So yeah, same amount. I left a large law firm in 2016 as well. So, but we've practiced primarily separately, which is why I think it's really interesting that you have developed your own like systems, approaches, experiences completely at the same time, but separate from mine. So I have a lot to learn from you. So the premise of the podcast is that there's a lot of stuff out there that's trying to get young entrepreneurs to buy what they call boring businesses, which are like HVAC, home services, coin laundry, storage units, all of that stuff. And you get a lot of subscribers if you're like, become a billionaire overnight. And you don't get as many subscribers if you're like, it's actually quite a challenge. But that's one of the things that I wanted to make sure that we, give people who are considering doing this some background information so that they don't enter into this like buying a boring business thinking it's going to be a super easy way to become a billionaire overnight. It's not a bad way to make a living though. It's a great way to build wealth in a more like incremental fashion. So it's a lot of process. So I was hoping you could tell me some of the things that you see that kind of people misunderstand before they're buying a business or that causes them to fail either in business or in the deal process itself.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I see is, as you said, people getting into it, not understanding the amount of work that it's going to be, which is probably a very common theme, right? Based on what I've seen from your podcast, people mention that a lot, that it is a lot of work. Selling a business is a lot of work also. So if your plan is, I'm going to be buying and selling a lot of businesses, you have to get to the point where those businesses are cash flowing enough to hire people to handle all that, or it's going to be a lot of work. People don't always love to do that because that means I'm making less money. And so there's always a balance when you're doing that of, am I going to be buying myself a job, right? Which a lot of people want. They're just tired of being in the corporate ladder and going somewhere and not knowing if they're going to be fired. They'd rather not know if they're going to fail rather than not know if they're going to be fired and deal with all the corporate stuff, right? Which makes sense.
Right.
And then or you're going to make less money. And it's really hard, especially in those, let's say you have one business, to say, well, I guess I'm going to make $50,000 this year until I find something else that I'm going to invest in that makes any sense for me. And so just thinking through what that looks like for you and what matters to you individually. For some people that doesn't, they don't care. They have other means of income. They're maybe going to break even on a business for a few years and it doesn't matter to them. That's just something to think about, right? As you're being realistic about what you need. And I don't see a lot of brokers aren't going to have that conversation with a buyer,
Right.
and attorneys are hesitant also to jump in and start questioning whether something makes sense. We're more willing to do it, I think, right? But it's
Yeah.
hard to get, you have to build that relationship with a client before I can jump in and say, hey, does this make sense for you?
Totally. And then there's this kind of there's always such a gravitational pull to closing. In my instance, I always warn my clients, like, I get a lot of referrals from bankers and brokers, and that doesn't continue if I'm just killing deals right and left. So I too, even though I'm the least motivated to get to closing because I get paid either way as the lawyer, I'm still wanting it to get to closing. The buyer has the sunk cost, this, like, what is that fallacy? The sunk cost fallacy, where they're like, oh gosh, I've already invested too much time. Let's just keep going, even though it's a bad deal. The broker's pushing it because they get paid at closing. The banker gets paid at closing. So there's really not a lot of people around who can say, how are you going to support your family? There's no cash flow left at the end of this. And the bankers might care about that because they're mostly concerned about making sure they get paid. But that's a little bit of a different angle than being like, well, yeah, you might be able to subsist off of $65,000 a year, but what's your plan? Because I know that your wife is having another kid or whatever. Those are really good conversations to have. What do you think people are missing at the beginning? Why do you think they get into businesses where they can't even like take a good salary?
I think it's the numbers are a little hidden when
Yeah,
you get into the same thing you're talking about, right? Buy a bunch of boring businesses.
yeah,
Yes, that can be a fantastic way to make money and to have independence in your life. To have flexibility as maybe a remote worker, whatever you're trying to get to, whether that's money, freedom, security, a plan for your family for the future. You want this to be a family business. You want to, you know, maybe you want to just start a private equity company and start rolling up businesses. You just like doing deals. That's what's fun for you. That's great. That's different than operating, which is probably the next point we can talk about. But the whole process is intended to sell a business to somebody, and just like any other sales pitch, that's not going to explain everything that may go wrong or what your issues may be through that process. So let's say you have an accountant who says, "Yep, the numbers are correct."
yeah,
They're busy doing tax filings. They're maybe they aren't understanding the question you're asking. Let's say you don't have a broker on your side who
right.
is seeing you as a long-term prospect to help you find deals for the long term. Maybe you don't have a broker at all, or maybe you don't have one who can do that with you, who's willing to risk the deal to make sure you get into a good one. Uh, so you look at these numbers and they say, yeah, we did this last year. Our job as the attorneys, and I actually had a deal just recently with a lawyer who does a lot of deals a year, way more than me. Now that could be a good thing or a bad thing, right?
Yeah.
And that lawyer was extremely angry with me over the over the phone multiple times and extremely rude because we kept asking questions about the business and wanted them to fill out information in disclosure schedules, which is something you'll learn about. Basically, just telling us, disclosing to us, what are the issues with this business? What do we need to know about this thing? Are there environmental permits we need to know about? Are there customer issues we need to know about? Are any of these major customers going to terminate? And they eventually did it, right? But it was a lot of insulting language and anger just for having those conversations. And
That
that's,
is,
you know,
yeah. Well, and you're a good lawyer, right? So it's a lot of people would be so off put by that lawyer that they either got steamrolled and stopped asking, or they more likely, because lawyers are not that type of person usually, they would have gotten really mad, and then you had to have an eruption that could totally kill the deal. I mean, I've certainly had lawyers on the other side where I go, there's just no getting through unless you're willing to take a terrible, terrible term here. There's no talking sense into them. They're gonna talk my ear off all day long and waste your time. And, how do we get around these guys? I definitely have had large law firms engaged where they just chat. They want to talk about indemnification. They want to talk about fundamental reps. They want a cap, but they want three different buckets. They want a tipping basket for the indemnification. And you're like, bro, this is a $2 million deal. Like, this doesn't make sense. We are talking about a $4,000 issue, and I know your rate is $1,000 an hour. So can we just nip it in the bud? But what are other ways that you as a lawyer see other lawyers killing deals or just not serving their clients in the process very well?
Yeah, I mean, this gets into a whole conversation around negotiation tactics and strategies. When you're making it about you as the lawyer and not about the deal, if you advise your client and say, "Here's the risks. Here's what okay, you want to go this way? All right, I'll try to do the best I can." Right? It's not about you if the other lawyer is attacking you or the broker is saying insulting things, your client is getting upset, the other side is trying to get you kicked off the deal. They have their perspective that you're a bad lawyer, right? That you don't know what you're doing, and that can be for lots of reasons. One can be nefarious, but that can be the biggest fatality. Is if you decide that the deal's about you, you're gonna fight for whatever you have to fight for. You're gonna fight with the other side. You're gonna be insulting back. You're gonna get the broker who that may be involved frustrated with you. You're gonna have your client wondering why you're picking these fights that maybe don't make any sense, and then you're gonna break down that trust with your client. And so there's lots of ways that can happen, and why you can end up there. And you may even think you're right at the end of the day. You may be right on that point, but you've lost the trust of the parties involved. And that's the most important thing when you're negotiating and dealing with those initial conversations, is to stay calm. It's not about you. You're trying to learn information from the other side. You're trying to build trust and credibility, talking basic conversation practices. Talk clearly, try to maintain eye contact, even though, we're on the screens and I'm looking all over the place. Try to be present, stand up, face the screen, right? If you're doing a video conference, you establish those markers of confidence and credibility just by having basic processes, right? Basic plan, and for the initial contact. Then, if you don't know what you want to say, you don't know how to react to a situation, don't freak out. Be calm.
Yeah.
You don't have to say something. And we're taught this all the time, right? But our clients are not always taught this. You don't have to respond to something in the moment. You can move past a point and just ignore it. Attorneys especially are used to doing that. I don't know. I'll get back to you. Let me think
Yeah.
about that. That's great.
Yeah. That's all good advice. And the trust with the client thing, I think, is so important because a lot of times this is the buyer's first time going through the process, or the seller's first and only time going through the process. And so if you are kind of the boy who cried wolf on every point, they're gonna just get completely fatigued, not be able to tell the difference between, oh, it's really important that I'm personally guaranteeing, like I'm personally on the hooks for the reps and warranties here. That's really important. But they also say that the limitation of liability thing is really important in the jury trial waiver and the indemnification. And how can everything be so important? And if I push back on everything, I'll get nothing. And which one's the most? And
Yeah.
so at the very beginning of my career, when I was, or my, out here career as a business owner, I did a lot of startup work, and I would sometimes have the time to put an agreement together for my clients where I would color everything yellow, red, and green. Like green, you can negotiate this. Yellow, ask me first. Red, you don't even have to ask me. Don't negotiate this. And I think a lot of people wind up paired with business attorneys who are not business owners. Like you and I own a business. We've owned businesses, we've run businesses, we've had to make those calls where, you can't, like, done is better than perfect, and you do have to take on some amount of risk, or like you'll never make a dime. And so we're a little bit more comfortable saying, this is a 10 out of 10. This is a 2 out of 10. Maybe we push back on it but we push like lightly, or here's something in between so that it will be well received. Like the messaging of redlining is a little bit nuanced. If you do it every day like we do, it's like you can accept red lines that you receive from the opposing counsel in a way that is just total jerk move, like outright rejection, like remove it, or you can accept the ones you fully reject. You can leave a comment about why you fully rejected them. That's nice. And then the ones that you can split the baby and come up with something that's, not an outright rejection of what they propose. It's something that kind of is a nod to what they're trying to do, but still covers your client. And I don't know if you're a buyer, how do you think you suss out whether you've got a lawyer who can do that, or if you just have like a hammer where everything is a nail and they're just going to make everything miserable?
It's hard. It's hard for me to answer that question too. I think and it's a good question, right? Because there is a real balance of the other side, and the broker really likes this attorney, which could mean they are fair and reasonable and do a good job.
It
It
could.
could also mean, let's just get the deal done. We know this person's not going to do anything.
Yes.
And that either of those can be really good for getting a deal done. I
That's
think
true.
people like to work with people who are fair and reasonable because there's risk with a bad lawyer too, right? So to answer your question, the risk is the deal's going to go bad later, and there's going to be litigation maybe between the parties, right? Which no one really wants, even if they're
Right.
trying to get the deal done as fast as possible. So one is there's at least it's hard to tell, I think, until you get into it. So you get a referral from someone that helps. At least talk to a few, get a feel for how they maybe interact. Are they super aggressive in their conversation? Are they do they care to understand what your deal is and what your worries are? You may not have time in an initial call to get all these things right, but that's a good indicator that they're trying to at least understand what you might be concerned about and what they then don't need to be concerned about. You can ask them how many deals they've done recently, how in particular. You can ask them, how often they do deals might be a better question, right?
Because doing a couple $100 million deals a year is very time intensive versus like I do my average deal size last year was like $687,000. So there's some outliers on both sides, for sure, that drug that down. I had some where it was the assumption of the debt that were zeros that pulled the average down,
Yeah.
but it was yeah, like that's a lot quantity. It's a great quantity.
Absolutely. And I think asking them their philosophy, right? And if it
Yeah.
comes off as disingenuous, then that's a good indicator. If I ask you, "Hey, what do you think about deals?" and you tell me what I want to hear, but it sounds so canned and fake, right? Oh,
Yeah.
I like to get a deal done. Okay, but if you can be specific about things that maybe you do worry about and things you don't.
Mm.
I try to do that with clients when it's something I started picking up anyways, is walking just, hey, we got 30 minutes as initial consult. Let me try to give you some information anyways, right?
Yeah.
It walk through what a deal kind of looks like from a paper standpoint, what a purchase agreement looks
Yeah.
like, what they need to be concerned with, maybe what we typically will probably spend more time on, stuff like that. So they know that I'm not trying to just bill hours. Here's things why we get concerned about this and maybe not that. You can't always go through all that in 30 minutes when you're getting to know people. Some people want to talk about hunting or sports or whatever, right? Some people want to talk about their kids. That's a real long conversation sometimes. So
Yeah.
it's
You
it's
should
a
try talking about sports when you don't care about sports. That's
yeah,
a
it's
much
the worst.
longer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or kids. Everyone knows I don't care about kids. Um, I'm just kidding. So I think it's tough until you get into it, and you have to
Yeah.
be prepared that hey, maybe this lawyer didn't work out because if you're getting into a negotiation and the attorney is arguing about everything, you're not really going to know until you have to actually deal with that because they
Yeah.
maybe for some reason they just hate the other party and there's a knee-jerk reaction to everything.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the times the lawyers on the other side that do a bad job, in my view, are just big firm lawyers, where it was my experience at a large law firm that the work product was in some ways substantially worse because there was a diffusion of responsibility. So you'd have one agreement and they would say, oh, we're not going to review the tax part, get the tax lawyer to look at it. And we're not going to review the one paragraph on real estate, have the real estate person look at it. And then there's no one person kind of seeing the whole picture and really taking ownership of it. And so you wind up shipping something out the door that, and also the person you're talking to doesn't feel empowered to negotiate because they're not the ones that made the call on tax or real estate or employment. And that to me is really challenging as somebody who's a little bit more scrappy. And I'm like, come on, make a decision. Let's do this as fast as possible. I like what you said. Nobody's ever asked me about my philosophy of deals, but I tell people all the time, I like shove it down their throats. I think a lot of people just don't know what to ask when they're talking to a lawyer for the first time. So, what are some failed deals you've seen recently, and what killed them, or what should have been done different?
So recently, kind of going back to the same negotiation process and talking about lawyers who don't feel comfortable advising their client. This is an issue that you run into with, I think talking about big firm lawyers, right? They're a lot of times used to dealing with, this is not always the case. And it can be very different across the board. If they're advising a startup client, they know, look, this client's not going to be able to make a decision here. But if you're dealing with a big firm lawyer that does a lot of M&A for a lot of private equity companies, the client typically makes a lot of those decisions and the lawyer advises on sort of the major ones, and the very easy ones they say, yeah, that's fine, just let it go. But anything that's kind of in the middle is still that they're not ready, they just don't feel comfortable moving off of. It's the private equity company is going to make that decision. For the most part, they'll advise them. Where that becomes a problem is if the lawyer never really learned how to advise like that, right? That doesn't happen until you're very comfortable with the client in those bigger firms, or you've been there for a really long time and you finally start to feel some sort of flexibility and leeway. A lot of the time, if your practice is M&A, right? And so what I see is lawyers getting stuck where they will not tell their client not to worry about something. If the client says, well, maybe I'm worried about it, they will jump on that and say, yeah, let's worry about it. Maybe that lawyer doesn't have a lot to do, so they're happy to bill hours. Maybe the lawyer is just very uncomfortable ever taking the risk that the client is going to blame them.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is, you have to advise your client, and then you have to say, if you're not willing to say, don't worry about this on the issue, which is, shouldn't do that if they should worry. But you can say, here's where a lot of people come out on it. Here are the risks. Some of them are more likely than others. At the end of the day, this is a business decision, but here's where, here's a direction that most people would take in this situation. Here's where the market kind of is. There are different ways that you can have that conversation, and a lot of lawyers just won't do it. So recently, this deal fell apart because the business team had a great deal. I was on the side that was partnering with these people to expand, essentially doing a merger and a buy-in. The lawyer on the other side seemed very uncomfortable with any risk. So the slightest, it was a loan that made no sense. They wanted all kinds of, they wanted their client to basically have full control of the company and no risk and full security interest on the loan with the ability to take back all of the company's interests, right? So basically,
Right.
I'm going to put some money in, but not really take any risk. If you default, I take the whole company. And while you're operating and trying to build this business, I'm also going to control the whole thing so you can't make any decisions on the ground. And it's going to be hell to operate, which any lawyer who has operated a business knows it's unrealistic. You're just setting yourself up for litigation. So that was brutal. We were never able, the business people could establish trust, but as soon as the lawyers got involved, no matter how the conversation went, she would not get off of minor points. And they would take them back. They weren't rude. It just never
I
went anywhere.
couldn't move. I've had that. That's a really good example that comes up a lot. And I mean, I guess if I reflect back on some of the first deals I did when you don't know what's market, you can certainly understand why somebody thinks, yeah, it'd be great if you have a loan document that allows you, it's collateralized by the company, right? They're buying the company with a loan. So if they don't pay the loan, they should get the company back. And I have a lot of clients ask for that. And I say, okay, let's think about it a little bit, right? So if they've paid 9/10 of the loan and they default on the last payment, you're going to take the whole company back and they're out 90% of what they paid you. Like, that's probably not fair, right? But if you're getting 10% of the company back, that doesn't really help you a lot. So maybe we come up with something else here. So just a personal guarantee. And then the same with other business activities is often, or like future business activities or whatever you want to call it in the purchase agreement, where you see people try to control from beyond the grave, where the seller's like, well, I'm going to sell, but I want to make sure that you don't move the office more than, 12 miles and you don't raise rates more than 5% year over year. And, they have all these stipulations where you go, okay, well, like, and usually they're kind enough, like it's impossible for somebody to even rationalize asking for that for longer than they're getting payments made,
Yeah.
right? So that's like the max reasonable-ish ask is like, let me control how you do things while you still owe me money. But it's such a bad call because you really need people to have the flexibility to pivot entirely if things are not going well. And I can tell all my buyers, like, if the seller thought it should be done differently, they would have been doing it differently. So you can 100% guarantee they don't agree with your plan if it's different than what they were doing. So, you're just going to be completely hamstrung trying to pay back these debts. That's really interesting because I think on the back end, that's a lawyer's job to explain and to always like put on the other hat and be like, but if I'm receiving this, here's how it's going to be interpreted by me, and at least have that conversation so they're primed for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's risky. It's difficult. And there are very reasonable good lawyers who never want to be in that situation. And so they're not willing to do it. And that's okay. The problem is if clients are going to trust you long term and you want to build a good relationship with the kind of client who wants you as part of their team and not just someone who is doing the paper, right? And filling out forms, which is it's a lot more complex, but that's how they're I guess it's easy for me to say that, but the that's how someone may view someone in that role. It's just, all right, great, lawyer, do this. If you want to be a partner and really be part of a team and the client that's looking for that, that's required is to truly advise. And like, I think that's great advice. What is the other side going to think about this? That's a great way to phrase it. Building empathy in your client and helping them understand the value of that and why building a team and a partnership without using those words too often to form a legal partnership. But building a team and a partnership for the long term, even if you're going to go your separate ways, it's really thinking through. We need to work together on this. This is not a me versus you. This is, I want to build trust as part of this negotiation. It's not about winning every point. It's about learning what you can. Let's say you're a seller. You want to learn what you can from the buyer about what they're really worried about, uh, what they may come back and fight you about after the deal's closed, uh, whether they're going to be successful. So you're not dealing with any of those issues after closing. The seller or the buyer is worried about, I'm trying to build trust so you can tell me what's wrong with this business. If you do that on the first one and I don't freak out, instead I go, okay, let's think about it. What does that mean to me? What can we do about this? Do I really care? That goes a long way. Okay, I'll let you know some more information that maybe won't go so well, maybe it will, but I'm going to trust that I'm going to tell you that. A good lawyer is saying you got to tell them regardless.
Yeah.
But maybe you're not having that conversation with the other lawyer. Maybe the other lawyer is not really very involved. Maybe they don't want to know that information. So there's lots of it depends, and the buyer and the seller need to build that trust. So it's
Yeah, you're leaving a lot on the table if you buy a business without going through the like negotiating deal document process. As dumb and silly as it feels, I think even if you just, irrespective of the terms, let's assume everything would have been just as good with a handshake, it's still such a valuable like stress test of a relationship. That matters for my business because it's professional services. So there's this warm handoff component. You really need the parties to be able to work together pre, during, and post closing, which is different than others. But at the same time, like I can't tell you how many deals where the negotiating of a contract just brought something to light that, you know, either fact based or just personality or dishonesty or something that was so good to know before, because it would have absolutely come up post closing. Like I had one where, and I don't normally do this, like they had already done the LOI, which I hate because I like to get involved in the letter of intent process because that's where all the deal terms are struck.
Mm.
But like they had already done that. They did not have a retention adjustment, which is like kind of a poor man's earnout, you know, where you just say on the promissory note after the first year, if I don't make what I think I'm going to make, I'll reduce the portion of the purchase price that's the promissory note dollar for dollar. And it could be a nice way to keep like the seller's skin in the game and make sure that they care about the transition, and also bridge the gap. If you think a business is worth like 2 million and the other people think it's worth 2.2, you can be like, all right, well, 200 is this note. I hope you're right. You know? And so it's a really useful tool. In this case, though, the buyer couldn't get straight information on billing information related to the business. And so it was just like, no matter how many questions he asked, he wasn't getting clarity. So we started negotiating the agreement. And when we added the retention adjustment component, which once again, I normally don't add deal terms, but it was called for in this instance. And when we did, they said, oh yeah, you're definitely not going to make 2.2 after closing. So we're not going to have our note, you know, be subject to that, because there's like, you know, if you're going to do this, it has to be like 1.8, because you're never going to make the 2.2, which was great because that was the assumption we were basing the cash flow projections off of. And it turned out that the guys, the sellers had not differentiated their hourly billings to account for non-recurring revenue. And so a ton of their revenue for the prior 2 years was like employee retention credit and CARES Act stuff that was just like a one-off that is not repeatable. But they had intentionally changed the verbiage they used to kind of bury it and make their gross revenue seem higher. And
Ooh.
so they, like when you saw the earlier document, it called it out, and then like the newer ones, they flushed it down so it all looked the same. And the deal fell apart because of the dishonesty, not so much
Yeah.
because of the actual number. But it was so important to know, and adding that was the only reason that it came to light. So it's like, trust the process. It can be a really valuable process.
Yeah, for sure. I think that the switch that we've had lately to empathy and really understanding each party through negotiation. I don't know if that's lately. That's probably always been what people want to do, but that's not what you see on TV, and it's a lot of the time, and it's not what you see in a lot of business negotiations. When someone thinks they're a really good negotiator, a lot of times they're in there just fighting and trying to pressure the other side, leaning close to them and being like, what's it going to take, right? It's sales tactics that are not nearly as effective as really building trust and a relationship. And that's the biggest thing, I think, when you start looking at going back to the question of what do I wish people knew, or how should they approach this as a first time buyer, with interest and empathy and understanding that it's going to be very different than you probably expected. And that hard part we were talking about, and the time and confusion and risk that it takes to get your first deal done or two, is much easier and more effective if you approach it with curiosity and openness, like you're saying, and really try to get to know and genuinely care about the other side. You will both be much more successful in that deal and future deals if that's how you approach it. Because those types of situations where you're going to run into an issue where the other side, you know, they weren't sure if they were going to tell you something.
Yeah.
And especially, I think, on some millions of deal, right? That $1 million value. So sub $5 million. The other side is going to be thinking, it's going to have those conversations and those dilemmas. And you want them to trust you, and you, as the person who's not sure if they should say something, which is usually the seller, needs to care about the other side. And that makes that question a lot easier. Because if you know, I should tell this person, maybe I'm gonna not make as much on this deal. Maybe it'll blow up the deal. But if I don't say anything, you're gonna be in a way worse situation if it's a real problem. Because you're either gonna seriously blow up the deal and your reputation, make it harder to sell the business. You may get sued. You may have personal liability after the deal, right? Which is a something we want to avoid at all costs. And so all those questions and problems and issues become a lot easier when you really care about each other. It makes it more fun.
That is so true. I divided my like diligent recommendations into preliminary diligence and confirmatory, which is the Harvard Business Review like terminology, guide to buying a small business terminology. But in preliminary, I like erased all the Harvard Business Review stuff that I give my clients, and I'm like, during preliminary diligence, your goal is to get the seller to like you. Like, do whatever you need to do to build rapport, and while you're doing that, pay attention for anything that they do that's like sketchy or dishonest for anyone, for a server at a restaurant, for, anything that they comment on where you think that was not honest. But otherwise, just curiosity about like, why did they get into this business? Tell me about the history of the business. Tell me about your family. What are your hobbies? What do you care about? What are you going to do after this? And because that stuff, like once you have that rapport, then the confirmatory diligence where you go through 367 lines of an Excel spreadsheet to ask a bunch of hyper specific questions can actually be maintained. Otherwise, it feels like just terrible, and people take it as criticism and get exhausted really easily and will just, basically think, well, they didn't technically ask about why, so I'm not going to mention it. So,
Yeah, yeah, that's a great point. And deal exhaustion is a
yeah.
problem too, right? That I think if I'm thinking through what blows up deals, sometimes that's it. I mean, that's what happened with this other deal in a lot of ways. The both parties just got sick of not making any progress because we couldn't get them to come to the table. What you don't want to do when that happens is start to not care about the other side because like I said, that kind of does carry you through that deal exhaustion piece too. I really want to see this deal be successful. And that the other party's willing to take a lot of risk and they're willing to do a lot if they feel like they have a good relationship with you. It can make a huge difference, especially in smaller deals. In bigger deals, sometimes people are hamstrung because there's a board and there's always, it's very different. They're really just trying to figure out what's going on, negotiate some pieces. Everyone knows what they're doing. They know the score.
Yeah. And their materiality threshold, meaning, which is like the term for the things that they consider even worth noticing, is so much different than in a small deal. Like I have a lot of people who hire me who have been running deals for private equity and now they just like want to buy a business themselves. That's a really common refrain for whatever it's worth. And I'm always trying to warn them, this is so different. You don't have a deal team running it. Your materiality threshold is not $50,000. Like you absolutely care about a $10,000 issue. You care about a $5,000 issue. So, you're going to have to zoom in and also take care to not exhaust your seller who also doesn't have a deal team running the process while they continue to run the business. They're having to do both. And that's so hard.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's hard to come back from it, if you not understanding how hard everything is going to be. It's hard to just I mean to when you're not having to actually get your hands dirty on everything and make decisions that are going to affect you and your family. That's a very different role, right? And so your whole perspective needs to change too, which I imagine is very interesting for those people.
I think so too. Because having spent time like doing mid-market stuff and then brought it down, I always tell people like, don't take your approaches for the mid-market and distill them down. Take common sense and church it up.
Yeah.
Like make it nicer. Because like your silly thing, like it's much harder to pare down than it is to just take it from, okay, well, a handshake would be this. Let's document it and build some pieces of what I know should be there as well. That's how you get away with not having a 100-page purchase agreement on a $1 million deal at least.
Yeah, yeah, that's very fair. And I think the negotiation tactic changes there too, right? I keep going back to this because it's something I'm very interested in lately, and I keep seeing deals fall apart because of it. I mean, we're always trying to get better at negotiation, but it has happened a lot. The conversations need to be very different too when you go from middle market to smaller deals because you're not necessarily just trying to convince the other side and have that conversation, which I can have with we did one of your clients. We did a smaller deal recently, right? And New York lawyers who were great. Were working for a private equity company, and they were one of the few times where I was like, very okay. they know how to get a small deal done also, right? So of course they're probably $2,000 an hour for the
Yeah.
partner, and they probably billed about as much as they were paying, or no, probably about half the price of what they were paying in taxes.
Oh God.
But it was we weren't, we can have a conversation where we're just convincing each other of things.
Yeah.
I get on the phone and the other side, the business people are on the phone. The conversation in a smaller deal needs to be more about how can we find a solution that's going to work for us. I'm going to be honest with you about my issues. It's not, I'm just going to try to convince you of some action that you don't need to worry about this. Here's why. Here's why I'm
Right.
right, you're wrong. That's a lawyer conversation that will stall things out instead of, hey, let's be honest. On this deal, for example, that I was talking about where the lawyer was angry because we wanted to go through the normal process and not just say, sure, here's a simple document that we don't need to really do anything on and we're going to collect fees. We lost trust, right, of everything that lawyer said. And so it created a real problem because we continually kind of were like, well, we just, the client, and I didn't even bring this up. Client just, I was kind of politely mentioning, well, if we have to verify that. And the client said, yeah, that lawyer's full of expletive, right? And I'm like, that's a fair impression based on what's happened, right? Not you don't necessarily want to go down the path of just trashing the other side. And we had to build that trust back up, and the lawyer had to work kind of hard to get that to happen. The way that it started to happen was the broker on the other side just started when there was an issue. He didn't try to sell us on something or tell half truths. He was very honest and said, "Here's the problem we have with that, and I'm just going to tell you the issue. You can tell me if you really want to fight or not." And that's how we tried to engage in those same conversations. And it's totally different than the way most people are thinking about it coming from the middle market.
That is true. It's very like who can beat each other up harder in the greater one. I found it's really helpful to be really like have no ego related to the things. Like sometimes I'll even, and maybe this is, virtue of being female, but I will even just kind of caveat something in a way. For instance, like I had a deal where they wanted to engage the sellers after closing to continue to work with them. Cool. But we were very specific, like you'll cover them on insurance, right? Because that'll be really expensive otherwise. And they said yes. And they confirmed with their insurance that they can cover them. But in their contractor agreement with the sellers, they said, sell, that these people will indemnify the company for anything that happens, right? And so it would cannibalize the insurance coverage. So, if you say, okay, well, the sellers are going to be responsible for anything that happens the company has to pay for and they're going to pay them back. It doesn't matter if there's insurance coverage. It's like a snail. So it's going to wind up back at the poor individuals. So instead of saying that, I just said, I didn't know this either, but a different attorney pointed it out in a recent deal. And it really made me think, what does this do to the insurance coverage component here? I mean, is that just a way for the insurance company to get out of covering the sellers? Insurance companies, right? They were so receptive to it, right? Because everybody hates insurance companies, and completely just struck the whole thing. But if I'd tried to just negotiate it like a ton of bricks, it would have probably been a big fight because they had a lot more negotiating capital than we did. So friendliness.
No, that's a great point. It's yeah. I think it is changing though. Are you seeing that change a little bit? I don't see it everywhere. There's lots of lawyers who are old school, but
Yeah.
I mean, are you seeing a different strategy generally in the market?
I do see a lot more small business lawyers who have a little bit of sense about them, and they get referred a lot. I think, but with the like internet and just all of the mastermind groups and everything, people can give really better references than you used to be able to get, where you would just go, "Hey, my neighbor's a lawyer. Hey, what do you do? Dog bites? Like, do you know anyone who could help me with blah blah blah?"
Yeah.
Which people still do, definitely. Like a lot of people come from referrals like that, but they're getting a little bit better. And then, the fees are so different at a large law firm that that alone is pushing people down to smaller law firms. And if you're at a small law firm, you're not, you're too busy to be just chest beating all day. So you're running a business, you've got lots of clients, and you're usually a business owner yourself. So you're a little bit more savvy. Is that what you're seeing as well?
Yeah, I think so. And you and I have our impressions of big firms. They're really great at big deals and managing
Yeah.
them and keeping those on track.
Yes.
Um, and they know how to deal with some of those issues. I
Yeah.
and they know they're mostly just dealing with each other too. And then the business people are
Yeah.
having conversations. It's a totally different situation.
Yeah.
Uh, Smaller deals, there's also a problem of there's a lack of attention to detail. I think on smaller deals sometimes, which
That's true.
you can run into that anywhere, right?
Yeah.
And
That's true.
there are always going to be things that you're going to have to fix for the other side, and the other side's going to probably point out to you, and
Yeah.
that's something you just need to, like you said, no ego. But what I do see, even in so total sidetrack, what I do see even in big firms is there is a general shift in negotiation to collaboration and away from the litigation style conversation. And I think there's a specialization going on, like you were talking about in smaller firms, where you're not dealing with so many litigators slash business lawyers slash pawn shop owner, right? And that is a totally different style of negotiation because you know that you need to think about the long term and how people are going to work together. And if you there is litigation is worried about, which you know better than I do, right? If I give up anything for my client, I'm going to get sued. and
Yeah.
and so a lot of those negotiations are not even real negotiations.
Yeah.
So which is you run into that when you deal with a business lawyer who's a really is a litigator and just willing to
Yeah.
take the conversation goes nowhere fast.
Yeah, there's so much CYA. Like understandably, I started out as a litigator, as you know, for the first 3 years. And it does. You put everything in writing, you document everything. It's so self-protective for the lawyer themselves. And they're always anticipating, because you can't get past it. I will admit, if you see somebody's cell phone records subpoenaed, you're chilled to the bone for the rest of all time about, oh gosh, this would be terrible if I was on a stand in a fluorescent lit room having to explain this gift.
Yeah.
It's understandable, but I agree that is a very hard specialty to this has been really helpful. I think I hope other people think it's helpful too. And I'm interested in the negotiation strategy stuff that you're consuming because I'm really interested in that as well. And it makes me think a little bit of I have a deal right now where I'm on the opposite side of the buyer, but the buyer is doing a extraordinary job of project managing in a way that's very collaborative. So the diligence process is coming across very much like, hey, we have a project we're working on together. Let me help as much as I can. And there's a couple areas I need to make sure that I got right. Could you help me with those? And it's a real masterclass in running a deal. I have nothing to do with it. I'm just like slow clapping and thinking, what a great job he's doing. So I'd like to see more of that. People just, really focused on not collaboration versus just fighting it out.
Yeah, we should talk more about that because I think that's going to be a real area of innovation over the next few years.
I think you're right. I mean, we're ahead of the curve.
Yeah, fair enough. No, I mean, negotiation, one thing for sure. That's starting.
Yeah.
I think that's taking hold. I think the process of diligence and how that's going to work for a
Yeah.
lot of these companies is going to be very different in a number of years.
I agree. Well, Mike, thank you for doing this. And how can people find you if they want to hire Mike Dornik?
sknslegal.com.
We'll put
Or
it.
it's is it do we have law group or legal? That's a great question.
sknslegal.com.
Yeah, go
But
there.
our name is SKNS Law Group LLP. Like,
Yeah.
pretty sure. We'll put it in the show notes. All right. Thanks for coming on. I appreciate it. Take care.
Thanks for having me.